A racist police officer punches a black man, but it turns out the black man is a fellow police officer. Darius Reed moved his cart down the grocery aisle, his mind focused on picking out his usual items. Days off were rare, and he relished the quiet time. No uniform, no badge, just him blending in like everyone else. The steady hum of conversation and the soft music overhead filled the store. An easy rhythm. He grabbed a carton of milk and tossed it into his cart when a sharp voice broke through the calm. "What do you think you're doing?" The tone was biting, accusatory, and it seemed to slice through the soft, comfortable murmur of the store. Darius turned toward the registers. Near the front, he saw a white man in a worn leather jacket standing a bit too close to a young black cashier. Even from a distance, Darius recognized the man's posture, the rigid way he stood over the cashier. There was no mistaking it. Authority cloaked in aggression. He squinted, recognizing the man's face. Tom Latham. Darius had seen him around the precinct. Tom was an officer too, a fact that had gotten him out of a few complaints over the years, but his reputation was anything but spotless. "What did you say?" The young cashier's voice, softer, strained, reached him. "Don't play dumb," Tom sneered. "I saw you slip something under the counter. Thought I wouldn't notice, huh?" The kid, looking barely old enough to be working, seemed to shrink under Tom's scrutiny. Darius could see his face redden as he stammered, trying to explain himself. I didn't take anything, sir," the cashier said, looking around nervously, as if seeking someone to intervene. Darius's fingers tightened on the cart handle. It was hard to watch the scene unfold, but he held back, observing, waiting to see if it would de-escalate. "You think I'm blind?" Tom's voice grew louder, pulling in the attention of the nearby shoppers. "I could have you arrested on the spot." The threat hung in the air. The other customers began glancing around uncomfortably, some shifting their weight, others averting their eyes, as if that would somehow erase what they were witnessing. Darius leaned forward, his grip relaxing as he readied himself to intervene if needed. Tom's intimidation tactics were all too familiar. A push, a shove, an accusation to make sure his authority was unquestioned. And all the while, the kid's voice grew smaller, his attempts to defend himself quieter. "I didn't steal anything, I swear," the cashier mumbled, voice cracking. "Oh, so now you're calling me a liar?" Tom said, his tone laced with mock outrage. "I'd love to see how this plays out in a holding cell. You think I'm bluffing?" A few of the shoppers had stopped to watch openly now, some whispering, others exchanging worried looks. Still, no one stepped forward. Darius felt a slow burn build in his chest, a familiar frustration. The silence around Tom's behavior wasn't just discomfort, it was complicity. Finally, he let go of his cart and walked forward, hands casually at his sides, expression calm but unyielding. "Hey, everything all right here?" Darius asked, voice steady. Tom turned, sizing him up with a scowl. "This kid here thinks he can get away with stealing," he said, jerking a thumb toward the cashier. "Not on my watch." Darius met Tom's gaze, unflinching. "Is that so? Seems like a pretty serious accusation for just grocery shopping." Tom's eyes narrowed, recognizing him, but the faint hint of familiarity only made his scowl deepen. "And you are just a customer, wondering what all the fuss is about," Darius replied, voice as calm as ever. The young cashier looked at Darius, a hint of relief breaking through his worried expression. "I didn't do anything, sir. He just started yelling at me." Tom snorted. "Sure you didn't. You probably think I'm just making this up, huh?" Darius held his gaze, keeping his voice low but pointed. "It's strange to accuse someone without proof, especially in public like this. Kind of thing could get messy." Tom's eyes flashed with indignation. "Messy? This kid stole. Don't tell me you're buying his act." Darius shifted, crossing his arms and letting the silence stretch between them. "If you're that certain, maybe we should talk about this with store management instead of making a scene here." Tom's jaw clenched, but he took a step back, his bravado wavering. He gave Darius a once-over, looking for any sign of intimidation. Finding none, He turned his scowl back on the cashier. "Lucky break, kid. Better watch yourself," he muttered, shooting one last glare at Darius before stalking off toward the entrance. The cashier let out a shaky breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you," he said, voice still trembling. Darius shook his head, giving the young man a reassuring nod. "No need to thank me. Just stand your ground, all right?" The cashier managed a faint smile. "I will." As Darius watched Tom disappear into the parking lot, he felt a surge of anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Darius watched from the grocery store entrance as Tom Latham, his jaw tight with anger, stomped across the parking lot toward his car. The arrogance and entitlement Tom had displayed with the young cashier had left a bitter taste in Darius's mouth. He knew he shouldn't get involved. It was his day off, and a scene in a grocery store parking lot wasn't how he'd planned to spend it. But something kept his feet moving forward. An instinctive pull to confront this man who seemed to thrive on intimidation. As he neared, Tom looked up, spotting him. The irritation on his face deepened, and he let out a mocking laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, for crying out loud," Tom sneered. "Can't you take a hint? This is over. Go back to whatever it is you people do." Darius stopped a few feet away, keeping his posture calm. "I'd just like to understand why you felt the need to go after that cashier in there. From what I saw, he was just doing his job." Tom's eyes flashed with irritation, and he crossed his arms over his chest, his voice dripping with condescension. "What I do and how I do it isn't any of your concern. You weren't there. You didn't see what I saw." Darius held his gaze, refusing to be rattled by the obvious hostility. "I didn't see anything to justify what you did either. Looked like you were trying to intimidate him because you thought he'd just back down." "Maybe you missed something," Tom snapped, his tone growing sharper. "That kid had sticky fingers. I know his type. They're all the same. Lazy, disrespectful, always looking for a quick way to cheat the system." Darius's face hardened. "Or maybe that's just how you see people. All it took was a single glance, and you decided he was guilty. And when I stepped in, you didn't even hesitate to treat me the same way." Tom took a step closer, his face twisting into a smirk. "Oh, I get it now. You're here to protect one of your own. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Swooping in to save that little punk, like he's worth your time." Darius felt a flicker of anger, but kept his expression even. "I'm here because what you did was wrong. You threw around accusations without a shred of proof. You threatened him, and you seem to think that's acceptable just because of the uniform you wear." Tom's smile faded, and his eyes narrowed with barely concealed contempt. "You have no idea who you're talking to, do you? I've been in this business longer than you've been alive, and I know exactly what I saw. That kid was guilty." "Guilty of what?" Darius asked, his voice low and steady. "Working a minimum wage job? Trying to keep his head down while you harassed him?" Tom laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "You think you're so much better than me? Just because you stepped in and rescued him? All you're doing is showing your true colors. You don't care about what's right. You just want to make a scene. Maybe you should think about why that is." Darius replied. "Why do you feel threatened just because someone stood up to you? Why is it that you have to throw your weight around to feel important?" Tom's expression darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. "Watch your mouth, or you'll regret it." Darius didn't flinch, keeping his tone calm. "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning," Tom spat, stepping even closer, so close Darius could feel the heat of his anger. "People like you don't get it. You don't know what it's like to put yourself on the line day after day, dealing with scum like him who'd steal the shirt off your back if you let them." Darius shook his head slowly. "I don't see anyone else here making those assumptions, Tom. I don't see anyone else throwing around threats." Tom's face flushed, his voice rising. "You don't get to talk to me like that." "Or what?" Darius replied, his voice deadly calm. "You'll try to throw me around, too?" The crowd that had gathered nearby was watching intently, their murmurs filling the silence between each barb. Darius could feel the tension building with each exchange, a thick, volatile energy waiting to explode. Tom's eyes flashed with a fury he could no longer hold back. "You think you're tough, don't you? Standing here, trying to make me look like the bad guy?" Darius held his gaze, his voice steady. "I don't have to make you look like anything, Tom. You're doing a pretty good job of that, all on your own." That was the last straw. Tom's face twisted in rage, and before Darius could react, Tom's fist shot forward, connecting with Darius's jaw. The impact sent him stumbling back, pain radiating through his face as he caught himself, barely keeping his balance. The force of the blow echoed across the parking lot, and the crowd let out a collective gasp. Darius straightened, his jaw throbbing, and his hand instinctively went to his face. He wiped at the corner of his mouth, feeling the sting of the blow, but his eyes never left Tom's. Darius steadied himself, the sting of Tom's punch lingering as he wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. The parking lot had fallen silent, the onlookers watching with a mix of shock and disbelief. Tom's chest heaved, his face still twisted in anger, his eyes flashing with a smug satisfaction, as if he'd finally put Darius in his place. But Darius wasn't about to let it end there. Keeping his gaze locked on Tom, he reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the familiar weight of his badge. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled it out, letting the silver emblem catch the sunlight as he held it up for everyone to see. "Darius Reed," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Baltimore PD." The smug expression on Tom's face vanished in an instant. His mouth fell open slightly as he stared at the badge, realization dawning in his eyes, quickly replaced by shock and a flicker of fear. You're a cop?" he stammered, the words barely a whisper. Darius didn't flinch, his gaze cold and unyielding. "That's right. And you just assaulted an officer, right here, in front of all these witnesses." Tom's face paled as he looked around, realizing for the first time just how many people had gathered to watch the scene unfold. A few of them held up their phones, capturing every word, every movement. The panic in his eyes grew, but he tried to cover it with a shaky laugh. "Come on, Reed," he said, his voice trembling. We're on the same side here. There's no need to make this into something it's not." Darius's jaw clenched, his voice growing colder. "The only thing I see here is a man who used his badge to intimidate someone because he thought he'd get away with it. You didn't care if that cashier was innocent. You didn't care that you had no proof. You just wanted to make him feel small because it made you feel big." Tom's face twisted with indignation, his voice rising in desperation. "You don't understand, Reed. I know his type. I've dealt with them my whole career." "His type?" Darius cut him off, his voice laced with disgust. "All you saw was a young black man, working a job he's probably underpaid for, and you decided he was guilty before he even spoke. And you thought you'd scare him into submission. You thought you could scare me too." Tom took a shaky step back, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "Look, I'm sorry, all right? I didn't know you were one of us. I didn't mean for it to get out of hand." "One of us?" Darius echoed, his voice edged with contempt. "You thought I was just some random black guy who'd stay quiet. That's all you saw." Tom's hands shook, his eyes darting around, searching for any way out of the situation. He forced a weak smile, his voice dropping to a pleading tone. "Reed, Darius, come on. Let's not do this here. We're both cops. We're supposed to have each other's backs. We're supposed to be a team." Darius shook his head slowly. "A team? A team doesn't mean covering for someone who abuses their power, Tom. A team doesn't mean standing by while you humiliate someone without cause." Tom swallowed, his desperation clear as he tried to hold on to the last shreds of his dignity. "Fine, I'll apologize to the kid. We can go back inside right now. I'll make things right. Just let's keep this between us." But Darius's resolve was unwavering. "An apology doesn't erase what you did, Tom. This isn't something I can overlook. Not this time." He reached into his other pocket, pulling out a pair of handcuffs and holding them up. The sight of them made Tom recoil, his eyes widening in horror. "You can't be serious," he whispered. "Darius, think about what you're doing. You're really going to arrest me? In front of everyone?" Darius took a step forward, his voice low but filled with quiet authority. "Put your hands behind your back." Tom's face went white, and for a moment it looked as if he might argue, but he seemed to realize there was no way out. His shoulders slumped, and he turned around slowly, his hands trembling as he placed them behind his back. Darius moved with calm precision, snapping the cuffs onto Tom's wrists, his voice steady as he recited the familiar words. "Tom Latham, you're under arrest for assault and public misconduct. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The crowd murmured, watching the scene with a mix of approval and astonishment. Tom's face flushed with humiliation as Darius guided him toward the edge of the parking lot, where a patrol car had pulled up, its lights flashing in response to the commotion. The officers who stepped out looked between Darius and Tom with wide-eyed surprise, clearly taken aback by the sight of a fellow officer in handcuffs. "Officer Reed?" one of them asked, glancing at the badge in Darius's hand. "What's going on here?" Darius kept his grip firm on Tom's arm. "This man assaulted me and was harassing a cashier inside the store. I'll be coming down to the station to file a report." The officers exchanged a quick look before nodding, one of them stepping forward to take Tom by the arm and guide him to the back of the patrol car. Tom struggled, his voice rising in panic as he looked over his shoulder at Darius. "This is a mistake," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You can't do this. You're supposed to be on my side." Darius met his gaze, his voice calm but unyielding. "Today, I'm on the side of what's right. And what you did back there? That was anything but right." With that, he watched as the officers guided Tom into the patrol car, slamming the door shut. The sound echoed across the parking lot, a final punctuation to the confrontation. Around him, the crowd began to disperse, a few people nodding in quiet approval, others murmuring to themselves as they walked away. Darius took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over him. He knew this was just the beginning, and that the repercussions would be waiting for him back at the station. But as he turned back toward the store, he felt a sense of calm resolve. Whatever came next, he'd be ready for it. Darius arrived at the station later that afternoon, the events of the morning still weighing heavily on his mind. This was a different precinct than the one he normally worked in, and though he didn't know Tom Latham personally, he knew the type. Officers like Tom tended to see people through a narrow lens, often jumping to conclusions and asserting authority in ways that crossed lines. Today, Tom's behavior had gone beyond what Darius could ignore. Captain Julia Hayes, the head of Darius's precinct, noticed him immediately as he walked in. She was known for her sharp instincts and steady leadership, and the look on her face told him she already knew something big had happened. With a wave of her hand, she motioned him into her office. Inside, Captain Hayes took her seat behind the desk, her expression both curious and cautious. "Reed," she began, folding her hands in front of her, "I hear we have an officer from the 8th Precinct cooling off in one of our holding cells. Apparently, you were the one who put him there?" Darius nodded, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, Captain. I was off duty, grocery shopping, when I witnessed Officer Latham accusing a young cashier of theft. He was off duty too, but still acted like he was above questioning. When I stepped in to de-escalate, things escalated instead. He threw a punch, and I decided to detain him." Captain Hayes was silent for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "So you've never met Latham before this morning?" "No," Darius confirmed. "He didn't know me either. I'm guessing he thought I was just a bystander until he found out otherwise." Captain Hayes nodded slowly, taking in the details. "I can see how that might have led him to underestimate you. Officer Latham has quite a reputation over at the 8th. We've received complaints from the community about him, but it's hard to pin down anything concrete. But this assaulting a fellow officer, that's something else." Darius met her gaze, his voice steady. "What he did wasn't just a mistake, Captain. He knew he could get away with it, and he thought no one would stop him. I couldn't let that slide." She gave a thoughtful nod, her expression both approving and concerned. "I'm not saying you're wrong, Reed. But making an arrest like this? It's bound to cause a stir between our precincts. We've both got officers who see things differently. Darius didn't waver. I understand, Captain. But if we don't hold each other accountable, then we're setting the wrong example. And Officer Latham's behavior crossed a line I couldn't ignore. Captain Hayes studied him for a moment before reaching for the phone, her face set with resolve. Then let's see what he has to say for himself. She dialed the holding area. "Send Officer Latham up to my office," she instructed, her voice calm but firm. Minutes later, Tom was escorted into the room, his expression a mix of resentment and embarrassment. He glanced warily between Darius and Captain Hayes, clearly realizing the gravity of his situation. "Officer Latham," Captain Hayes said coolly, gesturing for him to sit. "Officer Reed here has given his account. Now I'd like to hear yours." Tom shifted uncomfortably, trying to project confidence. "Captain, it's all blown out of proportion. I was handling a potential theft when this man," he jabbed a thumb toward Darius, "decided to interfere. I didn't know he was an officer. I thought he was just some guy trying to show me up." Darius shook his head, voice calm but firm. "All I did was ask you to ease up. You didn't hesitate to throw a punch when I didn't back down." Captain Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Tom, you're off duty, just like he was, and yet you escalated things to the point of assault." Tom's face reddened, but he tried to sound remorseful. "I admit I got heated. But, Captain, we're supposed to be a team. This doesn't have to go any further." Captain Hayes leaned forward, her voice measured. "We are a team, Tom. But that doesn't mean covering for each other when things go sideways. And what you did back there, that crosses a line." Tom looked away, his voice dropping to a defensive mumble. "I just did what I thought was right." Captain Hayes sighed, looking between the two officers. "Latham, I'm putting you on suspension pending an investigation. Given the circumstances, this is non-negotiable. Until we get this sorted, you're off the force." Tom's face paled. "Suspension? Over this?" Darius kept his expression impassive as Captain Hayes continued. "This isn't just about today. It's about how we treat the community, about respecting each other, and about how we carry the responsibility of this job. If you can't understand that, then maybe you're in the wrong line of work." Once Tom was escorted out, Captain Hayes turned back to Darius, her expression both approving and cautious. "You did what you thought was right, and I respect that, but be careful. There are people, even within our own precinct, who may not support your decision." Darius nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I understand, Captain, but if we don't start somewhere, then nothing changes." Captain Hayes offered a faint smile. "That's what I hoped you'd say. But remember, you're making waves. Watch your back." Darius left her office with a mix of relief and determination, knowing he'd done what was right, but aware that the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. Darius's shift the next morning started with a tension that felt nearly palpable. As he walked into the precinct, he could feel eyes on him, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. He'd known there would be fallout from arresting a fellow officer, but the reality of it was sharper than he'd expected. In the break room, a few officers exchanged glances when he walked in, some muttering under their breath, others pointedly ignoring him. He could feel their judgment and doubt, but he remained steady, grabbing his coffee and ignoring the stares. He was about to leave when Officer Paulson, a middle-aged cop with a hard-set jaw and years of service under his belt, approached him. Paulson folded his arms, leaning against the counter, his eyes scrutinizing Darius. "So," he began, his tone a mix of curiosity and challenge, "you're the one who decided to haul Tom Latham in, huh?" Darius kept his voice calm. "Didn't decide anything, Paulson. Latham made that choice when he crossed the line." Paulson's mouth twitched, a hint of a smirk on his face. "Crossed the line? Or just handled a situation in his own way? Some of us don't go around arresting fellow cops just because of a little misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Darius repeated, his eyes narrowing. "He assaulted me after harassing a kid without any cause. That's not a misunderstanding. That's abuse of power." Paulson scoffed. Tom's from the 8th. He's been doing this job a long time, Reed. Knows what he's doing. That doesn't give him the right to bully people, Darius replied, his tone steely. We're here to protect the community, not to lord over it. You know that. A couple of other officers nearby had stopped their conversations to listen, casting glances between Darius and Paulson. One of them, Officer Blake, muttered under his breath, "Here we go." Paulson shook his head, voice lowering as he leaned in closer. You think you're going to change the system by arresting one cop? You think dragging him down is going to make you some kind of hero? I'm not trying to be a hero, Darius said, his voice steady but firm. I'm doing what's right. And if that means standing up to someone who abuses their authority, I'll do it. The tension in the room thickened, and Paulson's expression hardened. Watch yourself, Reed. You might think you're on the high road, but not everyone here is on your side. With that, Paulson turned and walked out of the break room, leaving Darius with the uneasy realization that his decision had sparked something deeper than just a confrontation. The room was silent for a moment, the other officers exchanging looks before dispersing, their expressions a mix of uncertainty and quiet disapproval. Later that day, Darius was called into Captain Hayes's office again. He could tell from the look on her face that there was more to discuss. She gestured for him to sit, and he braced himself for whatever was coming. "Reed," she began, her voice careful, "it seems word has spread fast about your confrontation with Latham. Not just here, but over at the 8th as well. They're not exactly pleased with how this went down." Darius nodded, meeting her gaze. "I expected some pushback, Captain," she sighed, folding her hands on the desk. "I don't disagree with what you did, but some officers feel that you overstepped, that you undermined one of their own. Latham has a lot of connections, and they're questioning your judgment, saying you could have handled it differently." "How, exactly?" Darius asked, his tone even. "By turning a blind eye? By letting him get away with assault? He put me in a position where there was no choice." Captain Hayes raised a hand, her face lined with concern. "I get it, Darius, but this is about more than just your choice. It's about how it's affecting the department. There's going to be an internal review on how this was handled, and I don't want you blindsided by it." "An internal review?" Darius's jaw tightened, though he kept his voice calm. "They're reviewing me, not him." Captain Hayes nodded, her gaze steady. "Both of you. Latham's record and past complaints are being looked into, but they're also scrutinizing the arrest, your approach, everything. They want to know if protocol was followed." Darius's shoulders tensed, though he refused to let any frustration show. "I followed procedure, Captain. By the book." "I believe you," Captain Hayes said quietly. "But others, they might be looking for reasons to discredit you, to make this all seem like a personal vendetta instead of a necessary action. Just be ready for that." Darius took a deep breath, letting the reality sink in. He'd known there would be backlash, but hearing that an internal review would examine his every move added another layer of pressure. It wasn't just about doing the right thing anymore. It was about defending that decision against those who would prefer to keep things as they were. "I understand, Captain," he replied, his voice steady. "I'll be ready." Captain Hayes gave him a nod, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "Good. For what it's worth, you have my support. But be careful, Darius. People are watching closely." As he left her office, Darius felt a new weight settle over him. He knew that his actions had shaken things up, and now he was facing the full force of a system that didn't always reward those who challenged it. But he also knew he couldn't turn back. He'd started down this path for a reason, and he was prepared to see it through, no matter what came next. The tension in the precinct had only worsened since the confrontation with Tom Latham. Every interaction felt loaded. Conversations stopped abruptly when Darius entered a room, and the division between officers who supported his decision and those who saw it as a betrayal became sharper by the day. Captain Hayes, who had been supportive but cautious, sensed that things were spiraling out of control. It was more than just a rift between precincts. Darius's actions had exposed a deeper conflict simmering within the department. So, when Darius received a message from Captain Hayes asking him to meet in the conference room, he knew something big was about to go down. Inside the room, Captain Hayes was waiting alongside several other officers, including a few faces from the 8th Precinct. The air was thick with anticipation, the room so quiet that the sound of footsteps seemed almost deafening. At the head of the table stood Chief Alan Montgomery, a man with nearly 3 decades in the force, known for his fair but firm leadership. Chief Montgomery had built a reputation on maintaining order within his ranks, and his presence here could only mean one thing: he was stepping in to settle the matter himself. Darius took a seat near Captain Hayes, feeling her supportive presence beside him. Tom Latham sat across the table, his face a mix of resentment and unease. It was clear he hadn't expected things to escalate this far, and the fact that the chief himself was now involved seemed to unsettle him. Chief Montgomery cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping across the room before he began. "It's come to my attention that we have a serious divide in this department, one that, if left unresolved, could damage not only the morale of our officers, but also the integrity of this institution." He looked directly at Darius and then at Tom, his eyes narrowing. "The incident between Officers Reed and Latham has exposed issues we can't ignore. This isn't just about an arrest. It's about how we operate as a department." Tom shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if looking for support. But the chief continued, his tone firm. "I've read both of your reports, and I've spoken to Captain Hayes and Latham's commanding officer at the 8th Precinct. I've also reviewed the footage from that day." His gaze hardened, focusing on Tom. "Officer Latham, you acted outside of protocol. You accused a civilian of theft without evidence, escalated the situation with force, and assaulted another officer." Tom's face flushed red, but he held his tongue, likely knowing that any outburst could worsen his situation. The chief continued, turning his gaze to Darius. "Officer Reed, you stepped in to de-escalate the situation, and you attempted to prevent it from getting out of hand. I understand why you made the decision to arrest Officer Latham, and while I don't disagree with your motives, it's clear that the way this incident played out has created a divide that needs immediate resolution." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "This department cannot function if our officers are at each other's throats. We cannot have a force divided by precinct lines or loyalty to individuals over duty. So here's what we're going to do." The chief took a deep breath, his tone shifting from stern to slightly more conciliatory. "Effective immediately, Officer Latham, you are officially reprimanded and placed on mandatory training and counseling. The complaints against you will be reviewed, and any further issues will result in disciplinary action. This is your chance to prove that you're willing to adapt and work within the values we stand for. Abuse of authority will not be tolerated." Tom's jaw clenched, but he nodded, though Darius could see the simmering resentment in his eyes. Chief Montgomery then turned to Darius, his expression unreadable. "Officer Reed, I respect your integrity and your commitment to holding our officers accountable, but I also need you to understand that you're part of a larger team. When things escalate, it affects not just you or another officer, it affects the whole department. I want you to attend a mediation session with Officer Latham. This isn't a punishment. It's a step toward rebuilding trust within this team." Darius took a steady breath, absorbing the chief's words. He could feel the weight of the room's gaze on him, a mix of skepticism and support. But Chief Montgomery wasn't done. "I'm calling on each of you," he continued, addressing the entire room, "to support the values we are supposed to uphold: respect, integrity, and fairness. This department is a family, and right now we have some issues to work through. I'm not asking everyone to agree on every decision made here, but I am asking you all to commit to upholding our duty, without letting personal biases cloud your judgment." He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on both Darius and Tom. "I expect both of you to lead by example. Officer Latham, it's time for a change. Officer Reed, I trust that you'll continue to hold yourself to the same high standards you did that day." Tom muttered something under his breath, but the chief's piercing gaze silenced him. "This division ends today," Montgomery said firmly. "There will be no more talk of us versus them from either precinct. We are one department, one team, and I expect every single one of you to act like it." A heavy silence filled the room as his words settled over them. The chief gave a final look around, his expression unyielding. "This is a second chance, not just for the two of you, but for this department. Don't make me regret giving it." With that, Chief Montgomery stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Officers began filing out quietly, some still whispering among themselves, others nodding thoughtfully. Darius felt the weight of the chief's words settle over him, a blend of relief and lingering tension. He'd done what he felt was right, but the reality of maintaining unity while pushing for accountability was more challenging than he'd anticipated. As he exited the room, Captain Hayes walked beside him, her voice low. "You handled yourself well, Reed. This wasn't easy, but it was necessary." Darius nodded, meeting her gaze. "I know, and I'm ready to see it through." Tom, lingering near the doorway, shot him a cold look before walking away without a word. Darius knew that the resentment from Tom, and maybe even from some of the other officers, wasn't going to disappear overnight. But with the chief's support and the department finally addressing issues that had long simmered beneath the surface, he felt a sense of purpose and resolve. He was ready for whatever came next, knowing that standing up for what was right was worth every challenge he'd face along the way. The day had been long, the atmosphere around the precinct thick with tension after the chief's decision. Darius hadn't expected things to go back to normal instantly, but there was a sense that, at least for now, the department would hold together. He made his way out of the station at dusk, hoping to clear his head on the drive home. As he approached his car in the quiet parking lot, he heard footsteps behind him, quicker than usual. He turned to see Tom Latham striding toward him, his face twisted in anger. Darius felt a surge of wariness, instinctively bracing himself as Tom stopped just a few feet away. "You think you've won, don't you?" Tom spat, his voice low and filled with contempt. "Think you can humiliate me in front of the whole department, get the chief to slap me with a reprimand, and just walk away like nothing happened?" Darius met his gaze, keeping his voice calm and measured. "This isn't about winning, Tom. It's about doing what's right. You crossed a line, and now you have to face the consequences." Tom let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Consequences? You have no idea what you're talking about. I've been on this force longer than you, dealt with a lot more than you'll ever see. You're just some upstart trying to prove himself." "I'm not here to prove anything," Darius replied, his voice steady. "I'm here to make sure this department stands for what it's supposed to: justice and integrity. And if that means holding people accountable, I'll do it." Tom's face flushed with anger, his fists clenching at his sides. "Accountable?" he scoffed. "You don't know a damn thing about what it takes to be a cop. You think you're better than me because you made one arrest?" Darius took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "This was never about me thinking I'm better, Tom. It's about doing the job the right way. And you can't keep using your badge as a weapon." The anger in Tom's eyes turned dangerous. "You're just some idealist, living in a fantasy where people like you can actually change things. But you're going to find out the hard way that this world isn't built for people like you." Darius's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Maybe that's the difference between us, Tom. I'm willing to stand up for something, even if it's hard." Tom took a step closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You don't belong here, Reed. I'll make sure everyone sees that, one way or another." Before Darius could respond, another voice cut through the tense silence. "That's enough, Latham." Both men turned to see Chief Montgomery standing at the edge of the parking lot, his expression cold and unyielding as he walked toward them. The chief had clearly been watching from a distance, and his presence seemed to take the wind out of Tom's sails. "Chief," Tom began, forcing a weak smile, "I was just having a word with Reed here, sorting out some misunderstandings. Chief Montgomery's eyes narrowed, his tone calm but unforgiving. I think we both know that's not what this is, Latham. I've seen enough. This kind of behavior has no place in my department. Tom's face blanched, and he took a step back, stammering. Chief, you can't be serious. You're going to take his side over mine? I've been with this department for years. I've earned my place. Chief Montgomery's gaze was steely, unyielding. And in those years, you've left a trail of complaints and questionable conduct that should have been dealt with a long time ago. I gave you a chance to own up to your mistakes, to change. But instead, you're here, threatening a fellow officer in the parking lot. Tom's mouth opened and closed, shock and desperation flashing in his eyes. Chief, please, I didn't mean. Montgomery shook his head, his voice firm. It's too late for excuses, Latham. I can't have someone on this force who abuses his position. You're done. Tom's face contorted with rage, his fists clenched as he looked between Darius and the chief, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You'll regret this, both of you. Enough, Chief Montgomery said, his voice rising with authority. You're dismissed, effective immediately. Turn in your badge and your gun by the end of the day. Tom stared at him in disbelief, his face pale. You can't do this. Montgomery didn't flinch. You're no longer an officer, Latham. This isn't a discussion. After a long, tense moment, Tom let out a bitter, defeated laugh. He shot one last look of pure hatred at Darius before turning and storming away, his footsteps echoing across the empty parking lot. As Tom disappeared into the night, Chief Montgomery turned to Darius, his face softening slightly. I'm sorry you had to deal with that, but you did the right thing, Reed. You handled yourself well. Darius nodded, a mixture of relief and respect settling over him. Thank you, Chief. I know this wasn't easy. The chief gave a nod, his gaze firm. No, it wasn't. But keeping people like Latham on the force only damages the values we stand for. We need more officers like you, ones who are willing to do the hard things. With that, Chief Montgomery gave Darius a brief pat on the shoulder before heading back toward the station. Darius watched him go, the weight of the moment settling over him. As he got into his car, he knew that this was just one victory in a long fight for accountability and change. But tonight, he felt a sense of resolve and purpose he hadn't felt before. He was ready for whatever came next. The days following Tom Latham's firing were tense, but the chief's decisive action had begun to shift the energy in the department. Officers from both precincts gathered for a series of joint training exercises organized to foster unity, but the divide still lingered. While the drills required teamwork, Darius could feel the strained silence in between, a quiet barrier that separated those who supported his actions from those who resented them. As they broke for lunch one afternoon, Darius found himself in a conversation with Captain Hayes, discussing what more could be done to address the deeper issues in the department. He had tried to brush off the resentment he'd felt since arresting Latham, but after seeing the lines drawn so clearly, he was tired of ignoring the root of the problem. Captain, he began, his tone direct, we can't just leave this with training exercises. Racism is an issue that runs deep, and I'm done with pretending it doesn't. It affects our work, how we treat each other, and how the community sees us. It's got to be addressed, or nothing's going to change. Captain Hayes studied him thoughtfully, her face reflective. I understand, Reed, and I think you're right. We've danced around this issue for too long. She paused, a thoughtful look crossing her face. Would you be willing to bring this up to Chief Montgomery? If you're ready to push for it, I think he'd listen. Darius nodded. I'll do it. It's past time. Later that afternoon, Darius met with the chief, expressing his frustration and urging the department to address racial bias directly, not just as a side issue, but as a focus in their training. Chief Montgomery listened carefully, his face growing more thoughtful as Darius spoke, and by the end of the conversation, he nodded. I hear you, Reed, the chief said, his voice carrying a weight of respect. You're right. It's an issue that's long overdue for change, and I appreciate you stepping up to bring this to the forefront. On the final day of training, Chief Montgomery gathered all the officers in the training yard, a look of purpose in his eyes. Darius joined the crowd, his heart pounding with anticipation, wondering if the chief would address what he had shared with him. When the murmuring died down, Chief Montgomery began, his voice steady and authoritative. We've spent the last few days working together, rebuilding trust, and getting back to the basics of what it means to wear this badge. But there's something I need to address today. Something that goes deeper than just training exercises. He paused, scanning the group, his eyes resting on Darius for a moment before he continued. Recent events have brought to light an issue that has simmered beneath the surface for far too long. This department, like many others, has allowed biases, racial biases, to affect the way we treat each other and the communities we serve. And if we're going to move forward, we can't ignore this any longer. The officers shifted uncomfortably, the silence thickening as Chief Montgomery's words sank in. Every officer here has a responsibility to recognize and confront their own biases, he continued, his tone resolute. And I have one officer in particular to thank for bringing this issue to me, Officer Reed. Darius spoke to me about his frustration with the racism that too often goes unaddressed in police departments. He didn't hold back, and he made it clear that we owe it to ourselves and to the community to do better. Darius felt a quiet surge of gratitude as the chief acknowledged him, and he noticed a few officers turning to look his way, some with newfound respect in their eyes. The chief continued, Darius is right. Racism has no place in our department or in our work. So, starting today, we'll be implementing ongoing training specifically focused on bias recognition and addressing racial prejudice. This isn't a one-time effort. This is a shift in how we operate. We'll continue these trainings, and we'll work to build a department where every person is treated with dignity and respect. Officer Martinez from the 8th Precinct raised his hand, his voice reflective. Chief, thank you. I think a lot of us didn't realize how deep this issue goes, and I appreciate Reed for pushing for this. It's time we take a hard look at ourselves. Chief Montgomery nodded, his expression resolute. That's exactly what we're going to do, Martinez. We're here to serve our community, and we can't do that if we're not willing to look inward first. This department must reflect the respect and fairness we expect from each other and from ourselves. He scanned the crowd, his voice growing stronger. I'm calling on each of you to join me in this commitment. Officer Reed has taken the first step in bringing this issue forward, and now it's time for all of us to follow his lead. This department will not tolerate bias in any form, against our fellow officers, against the community. And if that's something you can't support, then you're not fit to wear this badge. The crowd was silent, but Darius could feel the shift. A few officers nodded, others murmured words of agreement, and he sensed a new understanding spreading through the group. Chief Montgomery finished with a firm nod. Today, we move forward together. We hold ourselves to a higher standard, and we make sure that every action we take reflects the values we stand for. This is our commitment, not just to each other, but to the people we serve. As the officers broke into applause, Darius felt a sense of validation and pride. The chief had not only listened, but taken his words seriously, using them to guide the department in a new direction. Officers approached him afterward, offering handshakes, pats on the back, and a few heartfelt words of thanks. Captain Hayes caught up to him, her smile warm with admiration. You did good, Reed. You brought this to the forefront, and the chief's right. It's a change that's been long overdue. Darius nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. Thank you, Captain. I'm just glad we're finally facing it. As he walked to his car, he felt a sense of fulfillment that had been missing for a long time. He was a black police officer, and he had just potentially changed the course of the black community in the area. He hoped that the department was on a new path, one where accountability and respect were more than just words.